Julian Sterling believed the most dangerous traps were the ones that looked like simple questions, and on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Manhattan, he had already decided that the quiet waitress would be his next demonstration. Inside the restaurant, the air carried the weight of old money, aged leather, crystal glasses, and a silence so polished it felt rehearsed. The kind of place where conversations happened in low tones and judgments happened even quieter. And when Julian stepped through the door in a charcoal suit cut with surgical precision, the room adjusted without being told, as if it recognized authority before it recognized a face. He did not glance around to seek attention. He assumed it, and that assumption was usually correct. Claire Bennett noticed in the way she noticed everything else. Not by staring, but by registering the small details that didn't belong, the slight delay in the maitre d's greeting, the way a nearby table paused mid-sentence, the almost imperceptible tightening in the staff's posture. And then she moved again, silent, efficient, a presence designed to be forgotten. She carried a tray of stemware across the floor with a steadiness that came from repetition, but there was nothing routine in her awareness. Every reflection in the glass, every shift in tone, every misplaced word was cataloged somewhere behind her calm expression. To most guests, she was exactly what her uniform suggested: a function, a pair of steady hands in a room built for people who never had to steady anything themselves. But Julian was not most guests, and tonight he wasn't here for the food or the wine or even the company seated across from him. A venture partner whose approval mattered more than the menu ever could. He was here to prove something, not with numbers, not with contracts, but with control, the kind of control that turned a simple interaction into a quiet performance. And as Claire approached his table for the first time, her voice measured her posture exact. Julian looked up just long enough to see what he expected to see: a waitress, nothing more. And in that brief glance, he made a decision that would shape the rest of the night. He would set a trap so subtle it would feel like courtesy, so precise it would feel like inevitability, and when it closed, it would confirm what he already believed about people like her. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that Claire had already noticed the first flaw in the question he hadn't even asked. Julian did not rush the moment, because men like him understood that control was most convincing when it appeared effortless. So he let the conversation at the table unfold with deliberate ease, discussing projections, market entries, and acquisition strategies with a tone that suggested certainty rather than speculation. While across from him, Daniel Reeves listened carefully, weighing not just the numbers but the man presenting them. Claire returned with a bottle of Bordeaux that had been requested without ceremony, its label understated but unmistakably rare. And as she approached, Julian shifted his attention just enough to include her in the perimeter of his awareness. Not as a person, but as a variable. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm, almost casual, as though the question had simply occurred to him in passing, "would you say this vintage is properly decanted for a deal of this scale, or would you recommend something more precise?" It was a strange question, not because it involved wine, but because of the way it was framed, blending service with implication, expertise with expectation, and Claire felt it immediately, the subtle misalignment between what was asked and what was meant. She set the bottle down with steady hands, her eyes briefly scanning the label, the year, the fill level, the faint discoloration along the edge of the cork. And then she looked at the glasses already placed on the table, noticing the pour that had been made earlier by another server, a detail so small most would ignore it. But not her. Julian watched her, not openly, but with the quiet focus of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the performance to confirm it. And Daniel, sensing something beneath the surface, leaned back slightly, curious now in a way that had nothing to do with wine. Claire did not answer immediately, and in that pause, the room seemed to tighten just a fraction, as if the silence itself had weight. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, professional, unchanged, but there was something beneath it, something measured and exact, because she was no longer just responding to a question. She was mapping the intention behind it, and somewhere between the label, the glass, and the phrasing Julian had chosen, she had already seen the outline of the trap forming. and more importantly, she had seen where it would fail. Julian allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to suggest patience, but not long enough to lose control, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as though the entire exchange belonged to him. And in his mind, it already did. He had constructed moments like this before, small, elegant tests designed to expose what people were beneath their roles, and he believed the outcome was predictable, because it always had been. Daniel watched between them now, no longer focused on the numbers they had been discussing minutes earlier, but on the subtle shift in tone that had taken hold of the table, the way a simple question had redirected the entire evening without raising its voice. Claire lifted the bottle with measured precision, angling it just slightly to catch the light, her gaze moving not over the label this time, but to the glass that had been poured earlier, then to the faint ring left on the linen beneath it, a detail so easily dismissed that it almost felt invisible. For a deal of this scale, she said calmly, her voice even and unhurried, precision is not only about the vintage, sir. It is about consistency. And she paused just enough to let the word settle before continuing. And consistency begins with the first pour. Julian's expression did not change, but something in his posture tightened by a fraction, because the answer had not followed the path he had set. It had moved around it. Claire reached forward, not to correct him, not to challenge him, but to adjust the placement of the glass by less than an inch, aligning it with the others in a way that appeared almost ceremonial. And then she added, "The wine itself is excellent, but it was introduced before it had fully opened, which can create an impression that does not reflect its true character." Daniel's eyes shifted to Julian, the implication settling in quietly, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Julian had intended to test her understanding, but in doing so, he had revealed something else, something small but precise. And Claire had chosen not to expose him directly, only to clarify the truth in a way that could not be ignored. The trap had not closed, not in the way Julian expected, and for the first time that evening, he was no longer entirely certain where the control of the moment resided. Julian did not react immediately, and that restraint was deliberate, because a man in his position understood that the appearance of control was often more powerful than control itself. So he allowed Claire's words to settle across the table as if they were nothing more than a minor observation, his expression unchanged, his tone when he finally spoke as smooth as before. "Consistency is important," he said, nodding once, as though he had always intended the conversation to arrive there. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted, not enough to be seen, but enough to be felt. Daniel leaned forward slightly now, his interest sharpened, not by the wine, but by the precision of the exchange, because what Claire had done was subtle, almost invisible, yet impossible to dismiss. She had not corrected Julian. She had reframed the moment, and in doing so, she had redirected the authority of the table without ever raising her voice. Claire stepped back half a pace, her posture returning to neutral, her presence once again that of a server completing a task, but her awareness remained anchored in the conversation, listening not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. And it was in those spaces that she heard it, the second layer Julian had built into the evening, the one that had nothing to do with wine at all, as Julian resumed speaking about the deal, outlining a timeline with confident clarity. Claire recognized a familiar pattern in the language he used, a sequence of assumptions presented as facts, a subtle compression of risk into certainty. And for most people at the table, it would have passed unnoticed because it sounded right, it felt right, and that was often enough. But Claire knew that tone could be as misleading as silence. And as she collected a nearby glass, her eyes flickered briefly toward a document resting near Daniel's hand, just long enough to confirm what she had already suspected. A single figure, understated but critical, had been positioned in a way that shifted the entire meaning of the proposal. Julian's trap had not been limited to her. It extended across the table, layered, precise, and designed to guide the outcome without appearing to do so. And now Claire understood the full shape of it, not as a question, but as a system, and systems, she knew, could be unraveled, not by force, but by clarity. Claire moved through the room as though nothing had changed, her steps measured, her expression composed, but her mind was no longer following the rhythm of service. It was tracking the structure Julian had built beneath the conversation. The way his words subtly guided Daniel toward a conclusion that seemed logical on the surface, while quietly bypassing a critical variable. And she understood now that the earlier question about the wine had never been about the wine at all. It had been a calibration, a way for Julian to assess whether she would notice the difference between what was presented and what was true. At the table, Julian continued with calm authority, outlining projected returns with numbers that aligned too cleanly, smoothing over volatility with language that replaced uncertainty with confidence. And Daniel listened, not skeptical, but not fully convinced either, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the document, as if waiting for something to resolve. Claire approached again, this time to clear a plate that had barely been touched. And as she reached forward, she allowed her gaze to settle for a fraction of a second on the page near Daniel's hand, long enough to confirm the inconsistency she had sensed earlier, a percentage that had been adjusted just enough to alter the balance of risk without drawing attention. A detail that would pass unnoticed in conversation but would carry weight in consequence. She straightened, placing the plate on her tray with quiet precision. And in that motion, she made a decision, not impulsive, not emotional, but exact, because silence would preserve her place in the room, but clarity would preserve something far more important. Julian's voice continued, steady, assured. It is a controlled exposure, he said, one that has already been accounted for. And Claire felt the final piece of the structure settle into place, the moment where assumption would become agreement if left uninterrupted. She stepped back into position, her posture neutral, her presence once again part of the background, but the stillness around her had changed. It carried intent now, a quiet readiness, because she was no longer simply observing the system Julian had created. She was preparing to reveal the one point within it that could not hold. The room had settled into a rhythm that felt almost complete, the kind of quiet alignment where decisions begin to form without being spoken, and Julian recognized it. The subtle shift in Daniel's posture, the slight narrowing of focus that signaled agreement was near. So he leaned into it with practiced ease, his voice lowering just enough to draw attention without demanding it. The structure is already optimized, he said, his tone carrying the calm certainty of a conclusion rather than an argument. There is no need to revisit variables that have already been accounted for. And for most rooms, for most people, that would have been enough. The conversation would close, the signatures would follow, and the system he had built would hold. Claire stood just outside the immediate circle of the table, her hands resting lightly against the edge of her tray, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharpened to a single point, because she could feel the moment approaching, the exact second where silence would become complicity, and she knew that once it passed, it could not be reclaimed. Daniel's fingers moved slightly against the document, not yet reaching for a pen, but no longer questioning the page in front of him. And Julian noticed that too, a quiet confirmation that his control remained intact. So he allowed himself the smallest pause, the kind that invites agreement without asking for it, a final opening for the outcome he had already decided. Claire stepped forward then, not abruptly, not in a way that would break the room, but with the same measured precision she had maintained all evening. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost deferential. "Excuse me, sir," she said, directing the words toward Daniel rather than Julian, her tone respectful, her posture composed, as if she were about to clarify nothing more than a detail of service. But beneath that surface, there was something else, something exact and deliberate, because she had chosen her moment carefully, not to interrupt, but to align with the point where her words would carry weight. Julian's gaze shifted to her, not with irritation, but with a quiet alertness, because this was not part of the pattern he had designed. And in that fraction of a second, before she continued, the balance of the room changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that could no longer be ignored, because for the first time that evening, the next move did not belong to him. Daniel's attention shifted fully now, not because Claire had raised her voice, but because she had not, and there was a precision in the way she spoke that made it impossible to dismiss her as background. "I apologize for the interruption," she continued, her tone steady, her eyes briefly meeting his with quiet respect. "But I believe there may be a small detail in the projection that deserves a second look," and she did not point, did not reach for the document. She simply allowed the statement to exist, clean and contained, as if it carried no agenda beyond accuracy. Julian watched her carefully, not with open challenge, but with the focus of someone recalculating in real time, because this was no longer about a server overstepping, it was about a variable he had not accounted for. And that realization, however slight, altered the balance he had spent the evening constructing. Daniel glanced down at the page again, his brow tightening just enough to signal a shift from passive listening to active evaluation. "Which detail?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, did something Julian had not intended. It transferred the next move away from him. Claire did not hesitate, but neither did she rush. "The adjusted exposure rate in the third phase," she said softly. "It is presented as stabilized, but the timing suggests it overlaps with a volatility window that has not fully resolved." And she let the words settle, not pushing them forward, not defending them, because the strength of what she was saying did not require emphasis. Daniel's fingers moved across the page, tracing the line she had referenced, and, as his eyes narrowed slightly, the room seemed to quiet around that single point of focus. Julian leaned back a fraction, his posture still composed, but his silence now carried weight because Claire had not challenged him directly. She had clarified something that forced the conversation to realign itself, and in doing so, she had not broken the system he built. She had revealed the one place where it could not hold. And for the first time that evening, the certainty Julian projected was no longer absolute. It was being examined. Daniel's eyes moved more slowly now, no longer scanning for confirmation, but searching for alignment. And the number Claire had referenced did not sit where it had moments before, its position on the page unchanged, but its meaning shifted because once seen, it could not be unseen. He leaned back slightly, the document still in his hand, and for the first time since the conversation began, he did not look to Julian for reassurance. He looked at the space between the numbers, the timing, the overlap Claire had described, and the confidence that had filled the room began to thin, not dramatically, not enough to break, but enough to let doubt in. Julian remained composed, his posture relaxed, his expression controlled, but his silence now carried calculation rather than certainty, because he understood exactly what had happened, not just that Claire had identified a flaw, but that she had done so without confronting him, without forcing a defensive response, and in doing so, she had shifted the authority of the moment away from him in a way that could not be easily reclaimed. "It is a minor overlap," Julian said finally, his voice measured, his tone unchanged, as if the adjustment required was negligible, one that has already been mitigated within the broader structure. And the words were precise, familiar, designed to restore balance without appearing to correct anything. Daniel nodded once, but it was not agreement. It was acknowledgement, the kind that precedes a reassessment rather than a conclusion. And his gaze returned to Claire briefly, not with curiosity now, but with recognition, because what she had offered was not opinion. It was clarity. Claire did not remain at the center of the exchange. She stepped back as she always had, her presence receding into the quiet order of the room, but the impact of her words did not follow her. It stayed at the table, settling into the space where Julian's certainty had once been unquestioned. And in that space, something subtle but irreversible had occurred. The system Julian had built had not collapsed. It had been seen, and once seen, it could no longer operate the same way, because control that depends on assumption cannot survive precision. And Julian, for all his experience, understood that better than anyone in the room. The conversation did not end, but no longer belonged to Julian in the way it had when he first sat down, and that difference, subtle as it was, carried more weight than any number on the page. Daniel closed the document slowly, not as a rejection, but as a pause, the kind that signals a decision has shifted from immediate action to careful reconsideration, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. I think it would be wise to revisit the third phase assumptions before we proceed, and the statement landed without resistance because it was not an argument. It was a conclusion drawn from clarity. Julian nodded once, the motion controlled, his expression composed, but there was no attempt to redirect, no effort to reclaim the exact momentum he had built, because he understood the nature of what had changed, not the outcome of the deal, but the perception of control. And perception, in rooms like this, was often everything. Claire had already stepped away, her presence dissolving back into the quiet choreography of the restaurant, adjusting a place setting at a nearby table, refilling a glass without drawing attention, moving as she always had, precise and unobtrusive, as if nothing of consequence had passed through her hands. But Julian watched her now, not openly, not in a way that would invite notice, but with the same analytical focus he reserved for things that did not fit his expectations, because he had built the evening around a simple assumption that he could define the roles in the room before anyone else had the chance to challenge them. And Claire had not challenged him. She had simply refused to fit within the boundary he had set. When she returned briefly to clear the final glass from his table, their eyes met for the first time without pretense, and in that moment, there was no performance, no test, only recognition. And Julian understood something he had not accounted for, that the quietest person in the room is not always the least powerful, and that precision, when paired with restraint, can shift an entire outcome without ever raising its voice.